Consider if you are a buyer and you have been searching for property and you have finally found one and you've fallen completely in love, and then you discover that it's recently gone under contract or it's already under contract. Perhaps you are a real estate agent working with buyers and you have faced this exact scenario. Well, a backup offer, a backup agreement, may be something worth considering. So let's take a few moments to dive into what a backup agreement actually is and how this actually may benefit buyers and sellers, especially in a very competitive market. So first and foremost, let's define what a backup agreement actually is. So a backup agreement is similar to any other agreement, except it contains a very crucial exhibit, and that is a Backup Agreement Contingency Exhibit. Both the GAR and the RE forms have this exhibit available. Now, in general, we would never want a seller to sign more than one agreement because they can only sell their home one time. The exception to that is a backup agreement. Now, the reason why the backup exhibit is so important is because it discloses the fact that that agreement is subject to another agreement, what the GAR forms refers to as a primary agreement. The primary agreement would be the agreement that's already in place now, and the backup would be the secondary agreement. Now, we are going to dive in and take a look at this exhibit itself in FMLS. So let's go ahead and dive in and take a look at that together. So first off, we are going to log into FMLS. Underneath Products, we are going to select Remind Docs Plus. Once we've done that, we can simply go under My Transactions, and I have already created a test file for us today, or you can simply create one if you would like to take a look at this exhibit and get some practice in. But as I mentioned just a few moments ago, both the GAR and RE have a Backup Agreement Contingency Exhibit. This would be an exhibit to the purchase and sale agreement. So it would be referenced on page 7 of 8 of the purchase and sale agreement as an exhibit, and it would be attached and completed. Now, the heavy lifting is done for us within the actual contingency exhibit itself. You'll notice that there are only a handful of blanks, only 3 blanks to complete in the body of the exhibit itself. First, it does ask us to identify the binding agreement date for the primary contract that is in place, and also the names of the buyer or the buyers. Now, in most cases, the listing agent, when a seller is willing to sign a backup contract, they are going to provide this information or won't have a problem providing this information to us. But we do want to get that information from them so that we can include that on the exhibit. Now, in the key terms of the exhibit, it says in number 2, upon the closing of the primary agreement, this agreement will automatically terminate and buyer will be entitled to a refund of their earnest money. In number 3, the buyer agrees that any amendments to the primary agreement won't alter the secondary agreement. And number 4, buyer acknowledges that buyer does not have a right to examine or be advised on the terms of that primary agreement or any of the amendments to that primary agreement. Section 5, very important and healthy paragraph here, says that in the event the primary agreement is terminated, the seller agrees to give notice of the same to the buyer. And this agreement will then become primary, no longer subject to the backup contingency exhibit. I do want to pause to talk about notice very briefly here and just say that per the terms of the GAR purchase and sale agreement and most other contracts, non-GAR contracts that we deal with, notices need to be in writing and they need to be signed by the party, meaning the buyer or the seller. So when this exhibit says that the seller will give notice, GAR has, and I will point this out here in just a moment, GAR has a standard notice form that can be used for a buyer or a seller giving notice to the other party. It can simply state in the text box exactly what the notice is for, and it can be signed. So do want to make sure that all notices are in writing and signed by the party. But keep in mind that notwithstanding anything to the contrary, the parties agree that the time limits except the delivery and deposit of earnest money will commence on the date that notice of termination of the primary agreement is actually provided for. Now, what that really is saying is earnest money is due when it's naturally due. So the agreement is binding when it's binding. If earnest money is due within 3 days from the binding date, it would be due within 3 days from the binding date, as in your traditional real estate transaction, unless we include a special stipulation to delay the earnest money. And we actually do have a special stipulation. If you are a solid source agent, you have access to it right here in Docs Plus, and I will show everyone how to access that backup earnest money special stipulation here in just a moment as well. But just know that all the time frames for your other contingencies, for example, financing and appraisal, the other contingencies will start, they will be measured from the date the seller gives notice to the buyer that the primary agreement has been terminated. Now it goes on to say that the closing date shall be the date listed in the agreement naturally, unless, because of the change in, and this paragraph can be a little bit confusing because then it says, because of the change in binding agreement date, any of the time periods for buyer to conduct due diligence, fulfill other contingencies, extend beyond the date of closing, then the closing date gets pushed back for 7 days. So just keep in mind the closing date is the closing date unless, because of the other time frames, due diligence, financing, appraisal, things get pushed back. The new closing date will be 7 days from the last contingency that the buyer actually had. So the binding agreement date, as I mentioned a moment ago, is the true binding agreement date, as in any other contract. Whenever the seller actually signs the purchase and sale agreement, including the backup exhibit, and delivers notice of that acceptance back to the buyer. But the time frames for measuring everything except for earnest money begin when the seller gives notice of termination to the buyer of that primary agreement, except for earnest money, unless we include the special stipulation. So effectively, the binding agreement date changes in a sense just because time frames are measured from the date of that termination. But it is actually an accepted contract when the buyer and seller actually sign this contract. Now, number 6 says that if this agreement has not become primary by, so the third blank to fill out is a deadline date. If it hasn't become primary by whatever date is filled in this blank, then the agreement automatically terminates. Furthermore, or moreover, the buyer can terminate this agreement at any time prior to receiving notice from the seller that this agreement has become the primary. So as you can see here, there are an array of upsides for the buyer because the buyer can terminate at any time prior to the backup becoming primary. Buyer may very well have a due diligence period even when it becomes primary. Oftentimes the question will come in, can the buyer continue to look at other homes? And that is a common scenario. Buyer does make a backup offer, the backup offer is accepted, but then they find another home. They simply go ahead and terminate that backup. But I am going to back up just a little bit because I want to show everyone 2 additional things here in FMLS Docs Plus. One is it's GAR Form F816. That's the notice form that I mentioned just a moment ago. This is a generic notice form that can be set up to give notice from the buyer or the seller regarding anything stipulated here in the text box. And there's a section at the very bottom for the party who is providing that notice to actually go ahead and sign it. So an email from the listing agent, a text message from the listing agent, technically is not notice from the seller. So just keep in mind, anytime a party needs to give notice to the other party about anything, there is a notice form that can be signed here to formally do that per the terms of the contract. I also want to show everyone the special stipulation that is going to be available in the special stipulations library. And if I scroll down here to page 7 of 8 of the purchase and sale agreement to our special stipulations box that we have here, if we simply select in that box, we have the opportunity to add a clause or create a new one. Now this clause, this stipulation, already exists, so we're simply going to select Add Clause. And if you select Solid Source Realty or Realty Georgia, you are going to then see the special stipulations available to you that don't already exist in the GAR forms library, special stipulations library. So we've gone ahead and added those to you based on the need or by request. And one of those you'll see here is earnest money delay backup offer. And if you're ever curious if this stipulation is what you were thinking, for example, GAR has an array of special stipulations for different things, you can always preview that special stipulation. And so, for example, this one says earnest money shall be remitted to holder within 3 days from notice that this agreement has become primary and no longer subject to the attached Back-Up Agreement Contingency Exhibit. So this special stipulation can be added and will very specifically delay the time frame for earnest money to be delivered to the holder.